Okay, hello, and welcome to this class on the rise of the Nazis. Um, this is us officially starting History B, so it's a new unit, new topic, although it's not quite a new topic because it's a kind of continuation of what we were doing in the latter part of the A unit. So you've already been introduced to the Weimar Republic, you've already been introduced to Hitler and the Nazi Party. So there is definitely overlap for these two units and these two topics that we're going to look at. The first one obviously being the kind of World War One kind of consequences, and then Versailles and Weimar, what we covered just before Christmas, and now this topic here. Now, I guess it would make sense at this point to give you a little bit of a signpost as to what you're going to be doing in future weeks. Today we're going to focus on points A and B, long-term factors that might explain the rise of the Nazis. And we're not going to dwell too much on that point A, but we're going to spend a bit more time focusing on point B, class antagonism. I think that's a really important factor in explaining why Hitler will eventually come to power in 1933. And then over the course of the coming weeks, we're going to look at economic depression, Nazi ideology, policies we can merge D and E together, Nazi propaganda, ruling elites, and divisions on the political left. So, and by the way, we can probably merge B, which we're going to look at today, class antagonism, with the role of the ruling elites. So in a few weeks' time, when we get to the ruling elites, I will make reference back to class antagonism, which we're going to look at today. Now, before we get to point B, before we start to explore that, let's just very quickly touch on A, which is the long-term causes. It's important to obviously know what goes on within Germany post World War One. You've covered all of this in the History A online books that you examined in the weeks before Christmas. Therefore, you already know about the German Revolution, the political German Revolution, which was successful, the social and economic revolution, which was defeated, that is the Spartacist uprising, which was suppressed by the Free Corps. Then you looked at other putsches, the Kapp Putsch, Hitler's own putsch as well, the Beer Hall Putsch. Economic crises referred to the Ruhr crisis and hyperinflation. The reason why it's important to know all of these factors and why they might be described as long-term explanations for Hitler and the Nazis coming to power is because of the instability that is very much present in the Weimar Republic, especially in the years 1919 and 1923. And there's a question that some historians always ask, and that question is, was the Weimar Republic doomed from the outset? I.e., did it ever really get over these crises in the early years? We do have, as I've referred to here, a period of relative prosperity, right? You've read about this, the 1924 to 1929 period, known as the Golden Years. And there is some evidence that things do pick up, that there's a bit more faith in democracy, that there's more faith in this republic. And Germany makes some pretty important connections with other European powers at this point. France, relations with France and Britain improve due to the Locarno treaties that you may have read about in your discussion or your study of the Golden Years period. So there is progress, but a lot of this progress is built on very shaky foundations, and the shaky foundations are the economic foundations, and the economic foundations of German economic prosperity of the mid to late 1920s is based on American loans. And when these loans obviously start to disappear, and when America faces her Great Depression, Germany is obviously going to be affected as well. So the relative prosperity issue will come back to when we study economic factors. You don't have to worry too much about these long-term factors if you were to answer an assessment question on this topic. I'm much more interested in the kind of shorter-term explanations that we're going to be covering partly today and then for the remainder of January. So let's move on and focus on not so much the long-term explanation. In this instance here, we're looking at a kind of medium-term explanation, what I call class antagonism. I guess you could say class antagonism is a really long-term factor if you want to go into a discussion about the development of the two classes within Germany, which we can trace back to the Industrial Revolution, or further, you can trace it back to the views of Marx. But I really want to connect what goes on within the Weimar Republic in the 1920s to what will eventually happen in 1933. But we don't want to touch on the 1933 bit. That's the role played by the ruling elites in giving Hitler the post of Chancellor until later on in a few weeks' time. Now, we've already touched on this again briefly, but it doesn't do any harm to have a quick recap. Here are the main political parties within Germany during the 1920s and 30s. You've got parties on the left, that's the Social Democrats and the Communist Party, parties on the right, the Nazis, the DMVP, the DVP, and then you've got a couple of centre parties, the Catholic Centre Party, the Zentrum, and the DDP, the German Democratic Party. These kind of different political positions that were within Germany, not that different from other countries to be honest. These different political positions are important to be aware of when I kind of move on to the next discussion, which is class antagonism. And we're going to look at how within this new German Weimar Republic there was a sense perhaps that those on the political left, and therefore the people who voted for left-wing parties and the working class, actually fared quite well under Weimar democracy. Weimar democracy was still capitalist, right? But there was a view that it was a bit more friendly, a bit more likely to grant some benefits to the working class than had been the case under Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany. So it's important to bear that in mind. And maybe the groups who vote for these right-wing parties, who are your lower middle classes, some middle class that I guess are in jobs like civil servants, teachers, etc., they possibly resent some of the progress made by the working class during the Weimar era. So I'm going to show you a little diagram. This diagram is not overly complicated, but it's the last thing actually I'm going to show you today, other than a couple of pages from a document that I want you to look at. This diagram is what I've called a timeline of industrial relations, right? But this factor I tend to call class antagonism, and I'm going to explain that. Now. Now I want you to put yourself in the position of the German establishment, right? So we're talking here about the groups that are kind of listed in that bottom right hand corner: the industrialist class, landowners, elites, the army, the middle classes to some extent. They all did fairly well under the old Germany, right? The Germany before World War I, the Germany of the Kaiser. And they had very much been in control of what was going on within Germany in terms of influencing government, decision making, foreign policy. Industrialists make lots of profit during the Industrial Revolution. Landowners still held on to some political control. The middle classes are starting to do quite well in Germany with expansion of the state. You've got the military who are in power, really significantly influential in terms of influencing the Kaiser and his government throughout the build-up to World War One. They are very much in the driving seat in Germany prior to World War One, right? And you know, because you've studied this, that the Socialist Party were despised, hated, mistrusted, seen as being a real threat to German unity and to German nationalism. You also know that in 1912, in the election of 1912, the Social Democrats got 110 seats, but 110 seats was not enough. Even though it meant that they were the majority party in the Reichstag, it was not enough to even lead to the Kaiser contemplating giving them any form of ruling government. In fact, and some of you may even have spoken about this in your assessments, the historical interpretation that was sometimes associated with Fritz Fischer, but also with Wähler, was maybe the German government in 1914 forced war. They went to war to overcome the growth of the Socialist Party. Now, I know evidence to support that is limited, but let's just say that there was this real hatred of socialism. You can understand why these groups down here, right, these elites, this German ruling class, you can understand why they find it really difficult to go from a 1914 position of absolutely no way will the Socialists ever take power to a 1919 position where the Socialist Party are now, that's the SPD, are now the dominant force within German politics. And it's not just that they're the largest party, they are in government. Now you could argue that they're partly in government because they have the backing of the military. Why do they have the backing of the military at this point? Well, because the military were useful to the SPD during the communist uprising, the Spartacist uprising of 1918 and 1919. And the Social Democrats under their leader, Friedrich Ebert, had to rely upon the Free Corps, on the army, to destroy this communist uprising. So there was a relationship there, one that kind of allowed the army to have more of a say than perhaps the SPD would have liked. But on the whole, still have industrialists, you still have landowners, you still have the middle class, you still have the army, but on the whole, the working class now have a political party, the SPD, who are governing. And what we see during the 1920s, once we get over these early years crisis of 1919 to 23, once we get to the kind of 1925 period, the period post-hyperinflation, when the economy starts to pick up and foreign relations start to improve, it's during this point where the golden years of the Weimar Republic arguably lead to improvements for the working class, right? Now, the improvements for the working class might come in different shapes and forms. In fact, you're going to look at the improvements that the working class experienced in the very first section of the My City activities on the rise of the Nazis. And what you're going to do is you're going to read a kind of extract from a book from the German historian Volker Bergen. And Bergen makes the point that roughly from the period of 1925 to 1929, there are a number of policies that the Weimar Republic socialist-led government implements. It's not always a socialist chancellor who's in office, but the socialists are still the dominant force in the government because they're always part of a coalition. It's just that the head of the coalition government might always be a social democrat. But during this time, and as I said, you'll read about this in the Bergen extracts, the working class make progress, right? And they make progress because they have a vision. The SPD have a vision of not just having political democracy, but also of having economic democracy. And what they really meant by that was a fairer, more equal society. Sometimes this is referred to as the Wirtschaftsdemokratie. Now, you might not think really that within a capitalist system you truly can have economic democracy, but the SPD did believe this, and the industrialist class and the landowners and elites started to think that socialism, so a socialist society, a society where the workers have much greater control over what goes on within the workplace, might be being achieved on a step-by-step, very slow, gradual approach, but slowly but surely capitalism is being eroded, and that the workers were getting more and more power, and they were doing so through parliamentary means by using their representatives in the Reichstag to pass legislation that would be beneficial to trade unions and therefore the working class. And we can maybe see some of this idea of socialism was coming to Germany through the back door in terms of the approaches or the methods or the legislation that were passed by the Social Democrats during this period. So we do get an 8-hour day implemented, first recognised in 1918, and we start to see some improvements for the working class. We get trade unions becoming more and more popular. There are 13 million employees working for German employers now covered by collective wage agreements. That meant that workers through their trade union representation had seen improved wages, and wages were kept at a certain level, and if workers decided to try and see their wages improved, they would go to their unions, and their unions would campaign for it. If strikes were required, then so be it. You also saw greater democracy within the workplace, with workers having a say on the committees of boardrooms, so the workers' voices being heard much more often. And you also had what is called the kind of compulsory arbitration courts. These arbitration courts meant that if there was a dispute between trade unions and an employer, it would go to an independent court, and that independent court would decide, this is also a government-backed court, would decide who was in the right, who was in the wrong, and quite often these courts would defend the right of the workers. Now, you might think, well, this is all fairly moderate. This is not radical communist revolutionary behaviour by the Social Democrats in government. They are campaigning just for a better way of life for the majority of the population, who are the working class. But these activities, whether it be an 8-hour day or whether it be greater intrusion into how a company was run by trade unions, all of these things were seen as being a real kind of move towards possibly some type of socialist society. And even if they are moderate, they are radical when you compare the situation to pre-1914. All of a sudden, these elite groups within Germany are having to listen to trade unions, and that doesn't go down well at all. Now, Friedrich Ebert, the socialist president of Germany, who is responsible for some of the improvements that go on in the early part of the period, he died in 1925. He was replaced by President Hindenburg. Now, Hindenburg, as you might be aware, was the leading German army general during the First World War, and he is no friend of the working class. He is no friend of democracy. He is no friend of the Republic. He is a monarchist. He is a conservative. he despises socialism. He's an ex-army man. So it's a bizarre turn in German political history to have somebody at the head of the government who doesn't really believe in the government or the constitution that he is meant to uphold. Now, in spite of this, right, Hindenburg is the president. It does allow for some of this legislation to continue to take place during the kind of late 1920s. You also have something called unemployment insurance during this period. So workers who are unemployed can be covered by an unemployment insurance scheme, and the workers pay into it and employers pay into it. So, and there's housing improvements as well for the workers during this period, new housing estates built for working class people. There are some benefits, but Hindenburg is never quite someone who can accept that he's head of a social democratic government. He's kind of having to do as they tell him, right? Remember, the president is kind of a ceremonial figure. He's in power for 7 years. He doesn't, or isn't meant to really have any power, but we know he does because he can appoint and fire the chancellor. And also he controls the army as well. Now, in 1929 we have this economic crash, right? The economic problems within Germany can actually be traced further back, as can be the case in America and so on, where there were already agricultural problems. But if we just, for simplicity, say 1929 Wall Street crash is the beginning of the Great Depression. Hindenburg and his advisors, and we'll get to some of these individuals later on as we study other parts of this topic. Hindenburg is kind of influenced, it doesn't take much influencing, but he is influenced by industrialist landowners, elites, the army, into thinking that maybe a different type of Germany could emerge out of the economic crises of the Great Depression. Maybe a Germany that is less democratic, maybe a Germany that is able to ignore the trade union movement, maybe a Germany that doesn't have to worry about the SPD and the millions of working class people who vote for the SPD. Perhaps Germany could return to something more along the lines of the period when the Kaiser was in power. What has this got to do with Hitler and the rise of the Nazis? Well, when we get to 1932 and when we start to explore the connections between this class antagonism, that's the class antagonism between this elite group of people here, right, that we have mentioned in the bottom right hand corner, their antagonism to the working class, trade unions, Socialist Party, Communist Party, and that antagonism goes both ways, right? Do these ruling elites in 1932 and 1933, do they decide that they would be better off putting someone into a position of Chancellor who might actually do their best to undermine democracy and maybe start to dismantle Weimar's democratic structures? Now, these elites don't really have anything against Hitler. In fact, some of them do hate him, right? They see him as being beneath them, right? But in the same kind of point, they don't really see Hitler as being anything extra special. Hitler, for these individuals, is useful. He comes along with a party that is growing and growing and growing. It's a party by 1933 that is the largest party within Germany. It's not that Hitler or Hitler's ideological positions or Hitler's anti-Semitism, it's nothing to do with that as to why they decide he might be the best individual to become Chancellor. Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor by these elites who are the influencers of President Hindenburg, the man with the power to appoint the Chancellor. They decide that Hitler might be the individual for them, not because of his sparkling personality or his charm or his looks, but because of what he stands for. Hitler stands for opposition to democracy. Hitler favours an end to Weimar democracy. It just so happens to be that Hitler also is anti-Treaty of Versailles, and most of these individuals in these groups are anti-Versailles. It just happens to be that Hitler hates socialists and communists, and so do these individuals. So he does fit what they are looking for, but it didn't necessarily have to be him. It could have been another member of the Nazi Party. It could have been some other right-wing group at this point. So you have got this class antagonism between elites and the working class representatives. You've also got the German middle classes and go from the lower middle class right through the kind of upper middle classes to what we call the German bourgeoisie. All of these groups also detest the working class because they see the working class as doing better out of Weimar democracy than perhaps they have done. And that is something we'll come back to when we study economic factors in our next lesson. We're going to conclude now. What I want to point you to are some extracts. These are the extracts that I mentioned. These are the extracts from Volker Bergen. You want to obviously examine this information before our next class and have a sense of the problems that Germany faced in terms of antagonism between workers and employers, and that is explained really well in this little extract here. So from this point here where it says we have noted how parts of the DNDP, that's the German People's Party, from that German Nationalist People's Party, from that point there through to all of this page and through to where it says Hitler, you want to read this information, and you want to read it whilst answering some questions that you can find on my site. I will email out information about this. All of the tasks and activities that you complete over the coming weeks, you will be tested on all of this information in a kind of quiz style, a fun, hopefully quiz style kind of activity, which we'll do as a tutorial closer to the end of January. But for now, that is all you have to know for this first factor, class antagonism. Thank you.